This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and today our guest is Sandra Crespo, who is a sought-after speaker, executive coach, and mental health professional who helps organizations build workplaces where Neurospicy talent can thrive. Her work sits at the intersection of mental health, systems thinking, and leadership development, reframing how ADHD shows up in high-performing environments beyond pathology or productivity fixes to real-world experiences like communication, burnout, creativity, and decision-making. She has spoken on major stages, including AfroTech, created the S.P.I.C.Y framework to help organizations turn neurodiversity into a meaningful advantage, collaborates with the National Association of Social Workers, serves on the board of CHADD, and is pursuing her doctoral research focused on ADHD. So Sandra, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with a little context here. I always like to start with, where did you grow up and kind of what were some of your early influences and, how you got to what you're doing today.
Yeah, kind of like the origin story. So
Exactly.
I grew up it was a balance between Puerto Rico and Boston. So family is from Puerto Rico. Most of my family still resides there. When we were early, I would say right at middle school age, we moved to Boston, Massachusetts, and was there for I would say most of my adult life and high school. And then I moved to DC where I'm based now. And
Mhm.
I've been here for the better part of a decade. Um, what has led me to this work? It's really a lot of my work really comes from what I've observed over time. So the ADHD part didn't really come until later in life. I have been a clinical social worker for quite some time. Um, but it wasn't until I was about 34 years old and working in clinical spaces and all kinds of leadership roles where I kept seeing people who were capable, like thoughtful and committed, but they were having a hard time sustaining, and that inclusive of myself. So I just started asking different questions. I started noticing different things about me, things that really just didn't work. At the time, I didn't really have a lot of language for it. I thought something was wrong with me. And from there, I just sought out, some medical advice, and working with my own doctor, ADHD came up. And you would think that as a clinical social worker, I would have noticed some of these traits in myself. But as the story goes, you know more about others than you do sometimes about yourself. And it put a mirror for me. And when I started to really read about it, I committed to learning about it. It changed my life and it changed my career trajectory. And that's when I really started to hone in and commit to this lane and topic.
Well, one of the things that ADHD in the past has always represented, I mean, it was always thought of as a boys or a male
Mm-hmm.
disease, right? And women very rarely, or girls very rarely, were ever diagnosed with that. So
Mm-hmm.
has that changed, or is the prevalence of it more common in males than females?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about neurodivergence, especially ADHD, there's often a focus on challenges. And yes, you're right. There is a lot more of a focus, or I guess maybe a narrative, that it's been sort of like a boys thing, because we are so used to equating ADHD with sort of that hyperactivity, sort of like bouncing off the walls kind of narrative. And we
Right.
see it a lot in boys. And so the ADHD shows up very differently across the board. And so women, girls, are taught culturally, mostly, right, to be more composed, they're quieter, they are essentially rule followers. And it doesn't mean that they're not fighting the same thing. It just means that it looks different. But we have ADHD hyperactive, we have ADHD where it's internal, right? And so it looks different in many And even in women across the board, it looks different in women as well. But yeah, that has changed. I think over the last, I would almost say a decade, we've been seeing a lot more of this research, a lot more inclusion around this, less shame. And one of the things I do like to make sure that there's a distinction around. So neurodiversity and neurodivergence, even though they sound very similar, they are actually different. Fundamentally, neurodiversity is an observation of objective differences in brain structure and function, right? So contemporary science basically has shown that every brain, even that of like identical twins, is unique in its own right. Neurodivergence is specifically used as a blanket term to describe those whose brains develop differently from most others. So simply put, society is proving ground for neurodiversity, but not everyone in society is neurodivergent. I
Yeah.
hope that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. No, thanks for that definition. So, we talk a lot about, an ADHD focus is kind of a word that comes up a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, you're working on your doctoral degree. You
Mm-hmm.
definitely do well in school, and often, school takes a lot of focus. So, it was focus one of the issues that you dealt with personally, or did you just learn how to control that better?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always say about ADHD and specifically focus, ADHD is an interest-based nervous system. That is how I like to describe it. It is really important for an ADHDer who is looking to succeed in any kind of way to find something that really speaks to their passion. We have a very hard time, quote unquote, focusing or hooking on to things that feel boring to us, that feel uninteresting, that don't really make sense. We're very analytical. And so when it comes to school, I have been able to find ways to keep myself interested in the subject matter. I only pursued my doctorates because I wanted to specifically focus on ADHD research. Otherwise, I didn't find it interesting just to go back to school just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
Um, and because there's so much expectations, it's extremely voluminous, you have to have that interest and passion underlying it and motivating it. Because the focus piece, I would say that it's not that we don't focus, is that we focus on too many things at once. So the focus is just spread very thin.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So when you talk about, let's say I'm the CEO of a company and I have 1,000 employees. What
Hmm.
what percentage of my workforce do you think has ADHD? Because I would suspect that most leaders have no idea that anybody in their work force has ADHD.
Yeah, I mean, this actually is an interesting question and extremely different in different organizations because the possibility of even the workers themselves not knowing that they have ADHD is there. So if you're asking how many are officially diagnosed or have an official diagnosis of ADHD, you're probably looking at a higher rate than you would ever have thought.
Mhm.
Um, Now, specific percentage wise, I don't know, obviously, but that being the case, it is, I believe, a lot more common than people seem to think it is. And because it is so misunderstood, it is so hard for your own self to identify some of these traits. And because it's so stigmatized, you sometimes are discouraged from, looking into it more. We
Yeah.
can, kind of go into all of that, but it's probably a much higher percentage than you would think.
And with your experience and those that you work with, is it dangerous, let's say, to let that diagnosis be known? Is it a career blocker if people know that you have ADHD?
That's a really great question. So you're talking about disclosure. I always think about disclosure in a specific way. So disclosure to me is not a confession, it's context. It gives people insight into how someone works and what supports their focus and how they engage best. But if it's not a space that can sustain that, if it is not a space that allows for that type of sharing, then at that point it's just, disclosure without any type of safety is vulnerability, and vulnerability without any security is exposure, and nobody wants to feel exposed. And
Yeah.
so I encourage people to think about the ways they disclose and why. I wouldn't necessarily say that it is dangerous. I think that it's a double-edged sword. I think sometimes it can work in your favor and sometimes it can work against you. It really depends on the leadership, which is, the focus of what I do is training leaders to understand what that even means. If a person comes to you and says, I have ADHD, as a leader, what are you supposed to do with that information? So as the person disclosing it or thinking about disclosure, it's really about and asking a couple of questions first. Why are you disclosing it? Do you feel that disclosing it is giving justification to maybe something that you maybe made a mistake on or you were late or something like that? So are you disclosing as a way of an excuse? Are you disclosing to advocate? Are you disclosing to connect? Right? Like, what are the reasons for your disclosure? And does your workplace support that type of sharing? It's important to know those things before you do.
Yeah, for sure. As a leader, I believe very strongly that you can't treat everybody the same. You have to treat
Mhm.
people based on their personalities and what they do, and you approach them in different ways. As a
Mhm.
leader who hopefully is in the know and is diverse in their thinking, to me,
Mhm.
that would be a good thing to know, especially if I knew how to deal with that personality in a different way than somebody who doesn't have ADHD. So, but again, I can see how that would be kind of a little bit of a tightrope for the employee. Or the leader to try and figure out where you are on that spectrum. So just tell us a little bit about how does it show up in real life?
Yeah. So I talk a lot about like inclusive design. Is that kind of what you're asking? Sort of like
Yeah,
what
yeah.
how
I
does it
mean,
show up?
in other words, for you as someone who has ADHD, and for me as someone
Mhm.
who's working with someone who has ADHD, how does that show up in daily life and in the workforce and so on?
Well, it's I guess the best way to describe it, one, it is not to speak for everybody because again, I do want to honor that ADHD does show up differently for everyone. Personally, for me, working with ADHD, one of the things that I have learned, or living with ADHD rather, is unmanaged ADHD will absolutely sabotage your life, right? Like it is very critical to understand the way that you think and the way that you process. Because what happens is when we do not have that awareness, when we do not have that language, we are just going through the motions of what is expected. And that is where that feeling of incompetence, where we talk about imposter syndrome, genuinely feeling like we have to work twice as hard just to meet normal expectations, or rather just basic expectations, you start to have a lot of inner conflict, and saying, am I even right for this job? And a lot of shame comes from that. You then see a lot of subsequent diagnoses from that, where you see anxiety, depression, and what happens a lot of the time is it's really the fact that, they'll get treated for depression and anxiety, but sometimes at the core of it is unmanaged and unidentified ADHD. And so, how it shows up in real life, sometimes there are days where it just feels really, really hard for the brain to turn on. And I'm using very informal terms um, because that's truly how it feels. It is the reality of an ADHDer that when explaining some of their experiences and symptoms, the biggest thing is that it feels like they're making an excuse. And so when we talk about executive paralysis or task paralysis, executive dysfunction, what does that mean? It means that there are times where I could literally be staring at my computer and I know that I need to get something done, but my brain, literally in the most simplistic of terms, can't turn on. I personally call them bad brain days, right? Where my brain is just like, yeah, today is not it. Try again tomorrow. And it's really hard to get out of that. On the contrary, there are also times where we have a term, it's called hyperfocus. We're waking up with ADHD and you find this rhythm where you are essentially hyper focused for hours on end and you get the most amount of work done in a short period of time. And so it can be unpredictable. There are, of course, other things that play, just kind of different factors of life that play into it, nutrition, culture, job expectations, and environment. But ADHD in itself, a lot of the times we talk about it in a very positive way, and it is, and it can be very positive if you learn how to harness it.
Yeah.
If you don't, it can be very heavy.
So if you're okay going into your personal situation, tell
Sure.
me if you're not. But
No, I
I think you were in your mid 30s by
am.
the time you were diagnosed with ADHD.
Hmm.
And so just tell us, you summarized some general things, but what did you do personally? What was it like before that diagnosis? And then what did you do differently to function better in the world?
So I was in an executive, I was a VP at the time of this organization. And the reason why I even started to feel like something was quote unquote wrong was because I was genuinely making very silly mistakes in my work. And I consider them silly, by my own definition. There were mistakes that could have been prevented maybe if I wasn't moving too fast or if I was maybe a little bit more detail oriented. That was very unlike my own practice. And so I started to notice that. Then I started to notice that despite knowing certain deadlines, I couldn't get myself to work through them. And so I started to miss deadlines. And again, that was very much not my practice. And I couldn't get myself out of this rut that I was explaining earlier of not having my brain hook onto it. It just felt like every day I was fighting this brain fog. And when I started to understand and I officially got my diagnosis, I realized that I was working completely against how my brain is designed. And what
Mhm.
I mean by that is that I was in a position that didn't allow me to delegate too much. I was in a position that so many expectations were put on me in a way that it was only just my responsibility. But I understand that ADHDers as leaders, this is the reason why they make such good leaders, is because we are visionaries, we're big picture thinkers. We don't necessarily thrive in the execution part. And so, therefore, we have the ability to harness great teams with expertise and delegate and knowing we can move chess pieces, right? And so then I started to say, okay, the role that I'm in is not conducive to how. So I am actually setting myself up for failure. And so I left that company. I had the ability and blessings to be able to leave the company, take some time and really get to understand, okay, what type of work environment makes sense for me? What kind of work makes sense for me? How do I set myself up? Even things as simple as what does my office look? I know that my office needs to have sunlight. I can't really work in a cubicle. Understanding some of the things that I could have control over and working towards that. I also understood that I needed to follow a schedule. I needed to be much more regimented. And so when looking and discussing through interviews, understanding leadership, existent leadership in different organizations, it was really important to ask the right questions. What does the supportive structure look like? What are some of the things that are in place for different types of accommodations? And we can speak about that. But all of that came from the core of understanding what ADHD was and how it actually works. How does it show up for me? I was very tired, no matter how many hours I slept, exhausted. I would not eat, out of sight, out of mind. Water was a problem. I'd have like 5 different cups of whatever, and I would just still not drink. So there were just little things like that that show up in all categories of life. I'd be very forgetful, and a lot of this stuff I had attributed to my personality. Oh, that's just how I am. But that's putting the responsibility on other people to understand you. And so I just started to own a lot of that and understand why I did a lot of that and some of the habits that I had, put in place and went from there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think as in any leadership role or as in any human going through life, the better we understand ourselves, the better we understand how we're wired and how we work, the more success we ought to have or should have at going forward because we understand that. I
Hmm.
can see that, in a work environment that doesn't embrace that kind of individuality, you can really run up against roadblocks, I would think sometimes. And I've interviewed a lot of people on this program that are entrepreneurs, and I wonder often, I would think a lot of entrepreneurs probably fall into some type of this category where they don't fit into the norm. They don't conform to what schools are trying to get them to do and whatever. So therefore, they go off and do their own thing. And if they can understand what it is that makes them tick, they can be extremely successful in a very different path to get there.
Absolutely. And that you hit the nail on the head. That is why a lot of, I mean, you would be surprised. A lot of millionaires, a lot of billionaires, a lot of successful individuals are neurodivergent. And look at Elon Musk, for example,
Hmm.
right? He is neurodivergent. And so there are tiers to these, and then neurodivergence covers a slew of different diagnoses, autism, ADHD, we're talking uh, all kinds of different things, dyslexia, but the rate of intelligence, they're highly intelligent individuals. So it is not content, it is not knowledge that is their problem. It is harnessing that knowledge and putting it to practice in a way that makes sense to them. And so you're right. A lot of them will branch out from your typical 9 to 5. A lot of them will branch out and have their own businesses, you know. It comes with its own challenges, but it allows for a lot of autonomy because your typical, sort of grind is very much based on productivity. If you're not productive, what are you actually doing? You're not seen as valuable. Your competence is questioned. And when it comes to productivity on a very consistent basis, ADHD can be hard for that. If I am consistently expected to produce X amount of whatever every week and I'm not, that makes me feel like I'm not good for my job. When in truth, if there was a better conversation around how can this productivity show up differently for me, then maybe I can put that employee in a better situation. But that doesn't come if you don't have any kind of understanding or awareness of it.
Well, it's so true. One thing that I've always believed in, which a lot of people struggle with, is there's more than one right answer, or there's more than one right path. So, for instance, if we have an outcome that you and I can agree upon,
Mhm.
and I get there and you get there, and we both celebrate the outcome, it shouldn't matter how we got there. But yet, when you're managing people and leading in a certain way, it's often easy to say, well, you didn't show up today, or you didn't spend extra time, or you weren't there, at this meeting or whatever. But if you think about it, if we get to the same outcome, then why should it really matter? But I think people have a tough time understanding that or accepting that because they're feeling like, well, that person didn't do it the way I did it, but maybe perhaps if you have this ability, you could get all that done in a day that it took me to do 9 to 5 during a week.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say the what and the how. So if we don't pay attention to the how, ADHDers, especially those highly successful, sort of very involved ADHDers, they will be successful. They will meet that productivity, right? It's almost innate in them to really overcompensate. And I'm speaking really for myself. However, the how is really important because at what cost? So more often than not, we are meeting those deadlines, we are meeting these productivity metrics or whatever the expectations may be, but it is at a high cost for us. I'm not sleeping, I'm barely eating, I'm working overnight because my brain turns on at night versus the typical, 9 a.m. where everybody is supposed to turn on. And so at that point, you are overworking yourself and it never feels like you're able to catch up. Can't catch up on sleep, can't catch up on your task to-do list. So the how is important to the ADHDer. Yes, we can get to the same results. I will say something else that's really, I'd like to think of it as a cool little thing for ADHDers. Big picture thinkers, pattern recognition, conflict resolution, that's us, right? When you bring us a problem, it is very hard for us to sit in the, well, are we just talking about it or are we doing something about it? Because we're doers. We have to be doing something. At least our brain thinks that way. And so when you bring somebody in on a project, teamwork sometimes can look different for ADHDers because they move so fast that other employees may not be moving at the same speed. And so there's a combined accountability, you know, in that regard.
Well, maybe you just answered this, but maybe dig a little bit deeper. So, what neurodivergent traits
Mhm.
bring real positivity to a leadership team?
Oh my goodness. So if we're talking about big picture thinking, in my position, so currently in my main position, I'm a clinic director for two psychiatric clinics. My ADHD shows up in a way that is very visionary. I can think and see sort of like future, you know? I have a
Mhm.
strategy for where I want this office to be. And I'm also very creative. So typically ADHDers tend to lean very left brain. And
Yeah.
so we're very creative in our thinking. We think outside the box naturally. And so in leadership positions, this is very valuable. You are able to communicate a vision. You're able to come up with a strategic plan because most of us work backwards, right? This is the goal. If we're told that this is the goal for this, we can actually come up with a plan. Those are amazing qualities. We are also very deep empaths. We have, I almost call it like a sixth sense of almost naturally just reading between the lines. Most people will call it overthinking, but I genuinely call it to be a deep empath. I can absolutely, as a leader, it is one of the most critical things to understand my employees as human beings. It is a human-centered approach. I don't see them, and I refuse to see them as productivity structures, right? And so if an employee comes to me with something personal, I hold space for that. And I design my office and space to feel that way so that they know they can do that. That naturally comes from me. I think that is one of the most beautiful qualities of ADHDers is how empathic we can be, how connected we are emotionally, and how we can kind of see things, read between the lines without having too much information. And I think those are very, very critical qualities in a leader.
So,
There's many more, but those are two.
yeah. So, explain to us what does a holistic wellness environment look like when we're considering all the things we were talking about so far?
Mhm.
What does that look like on on a day to day?
Yeah. So if you're talking sort of like what I call inclusive, well, I don't call it, it's called inclusive design. You have different categories. So when you're talking about like decision making, so leaders can be clear about how decisions are made and what input is expected. Some people process best when they have time to think before responding. And so if as a leader, you know that you're going to need some deep input from someone, then there's prep work. Hey, we're going to meet on next week on this particular subject. These are the things that I'm expecting. You know, reassure any type of anxiety they may have because we automatically are like, what's going on? If we're being singled out, it's that prep work. Workflow, instead of like broad direction, clarity helps. And so when you're talking like, here's what we're working towards, here's what success looks like, and here's where you can check in if something gets stuck, right? Like that level of structure supports follow through and generally reduces confusion. And a lot of the times, what we do isn't just for ADHDers or any kind of neurodivergent individual. A lot of these things are very helpful for everyone, right?
100%. Well, yeah,
Yeah,
what you just described is the classic getting to know the personality types of each of your team and treating
adjusting.
them, yeah, treating them in a way that benefits their approach to things the most to get the most done. So how I
Absolutely.
ask you to do something and how I ask somebody else to do something could be very different, even though we're going towards the same goal. But understanding if they're a left brain thinker or a right brain thinker or what they need to make those decisions and to lead in a certain way is what I think makes a really good leader.
Absolutely. I think it's very important for leaders to know their employees because people work differently, like you just said, right? Some thrive in focused, independent work, and others do their best thinking in collaboration. ADHDers tend to work great in pairs, maybe not so much in groups, but definitely in pairs. If they have an accountability partner, which we refer to as body doubling, that helps a lot. A
Mhm.
lot of the self-motivation is kind of our biggest challenge, right? Where we have to keep ourselves accountable and consistent. But if we have if we externalize that, that works. So if me as a leader, I am delegating certain tasks to any particular individual here, I know who I can pair up with. I know who needs a little bit more support. And I don't make it a thing. I simply make it part of the ask, right? I'll give you a very, very specific example that I went through as a director. When I when I first started the office, when I first was hiring in and whatever, a therapist had came in from a different office. And this therapist came with, oh, she's not really easy to work with. She can be quite rigid. She's not very polite, et cetera, from the previous director. More than likely you're going to end up having to let her go. That was essentially what came with her. As I got to know her, I realized she's autistic. She also shared that she has ADHD. So now she has these two diagnoses that are very contradictory, but that opened up an entire understanding of how her caseload had been designed. So in her previous office, she was mostly working with adults. If you know anything about autism, they don't really operate in the gray, right? It's very much a black and white. They're very analytical, very structured. ADHD is the opposite. And if you're working with adults, especially in a therapeutic setting, that type of rapport isn't always going to feel so welcoming, right?
Yeah.
So then when her and I started to get to know each other, I said, how about we restructure your caseload and you work with kids? Why don't you start to begin specializing in children and adolescents? She was open to it and she has skyrocketed. She has a wait list. And why is that? Because
Mhm.
I had the understanding of how differently she thinks. I understood that the audience that she was initially set to work with wasn't conducive to her brain, nor was it ever really going to work. And the only thing that was happening is that she was feeling like a horrible therapist. She was feeling like this is not the job for me. This is not the lane. I made a mistake in this profession. When all in all, it was really just a matter of understanding her strengths and placing her in a better lane where those strengths can come alive. And she's
Yeah,
one of my top therapists, my top counselors in this office. So it's things like that are really critical to an employee success and you as a leader as well for your overall team.
for sure. Setting up a person so they can be more successful with the right considerations. I'm fascinated too, and I've talked about this on this program before. When you talk about having a partner, there's a
Mm-hmm,
book that was written a few years back called The Power of Two, and the
mm-hmm,
author's approach was is that some great things have happened when two people have been together. And examples were, Gates and Allen and Lennon and McCartney and Jobs and Wozniak and, these
mm-hmm.
different, two came
Yeah,
together
collaborative.
and collaborated and, probably had strengths from one side and somebody else had the other strength and together they were better together. And so I think that's fascinating that you say that people of ADHD do well with a strong partner or in pairs.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
One of the things I will say about ADHD is there is such a theory as hunters and gatherers theory. And I encourage people to look this up. But the hunters and gatherers theory is essentially at its core saying that all of the characteristics of ADHD that we consider deficits today were the same characteristics that were needed for their survival during those times.
Hmm.
When we're talking about working under pressure, thinking on your feet, leading, you know, uh, gathering whatever your community was, these are all traits that we still have today, but because our society has formalized in such a way that isn't necessarily the most conducive, they are now seen as a deficit. And so you have to do your very best to understand that these qualities of yours are actually very natural to human survival. I actually think that ADHD is the reason why there is so much innovation. That's why autism, is part of the reason why there's a lot of NASA. If you actually look this up, NASA has a lot of focus on working with autistic individuals because they are the source of such innovation, of such tech, that pushes our entire community forward or society forward. But we don't give it that type of recognition, even though there's so much that has come from these types of designs of these
Yeah,
brain.
that's really interesting. So a lot of companies in, coaching that we have is like you need systems in your organization. But
Mhm.
what systems and companies cause friction in neurodivergent professionals?
I would think any system that is just so rigid that there is no flexibility and there's no safety for conversation. I have this thing around reasonable accommodations. By law, of course, organization doesn't necessarily have to accommodate, but they're encouraged to accommodate. And when I think about reasonable accommodations, I challenge people to think about that. If your workspace is solely dependent on individuals advocating for themselves and requesting accommodations, and the organization isn't really too keen or safe, you know, for
Yeah,
any of those types of disclosures, what's going to happen? You're either going to have high, like the attrition rate, you're going to lose people, there's going to be a revolving door, or you're going
right.
to have really low morale. So if we think about reasonable accommodations as something that we can actually embed in the beginning, right? When we are designing our culture, when we are designing our programs, when we are designing processes in my world with clients, if we embed it from the very beginning, then they're part of effective leadership and good management. It it doesn't have to be seen as accommodations, and that weight is lifted from the employee, and that shame and stigma that usually accompanies that type of advocacy is lifted because the organization has owned some of this. And to give you another very specific example, because I like tangibles, I like people to understand what this feels and sounds like. In the front desk, people come in, my specific profession and role here, they come in for their appointments and they check in at the front desk, correct? They typically pay their copay and the provider will come get them in the waiting room. There are times where you may be paying your copay and your card may have declined. For anybody, that can feel a bit embarrassing.
Yeah,
For specific ADHD clients, whether they know it or not, there is such a thing as RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, and we feel rejection tenfold. So much so that can actually deter that client from coming back if the front desk person says, hey, your card declined, and it is shared in a way that other people can hear, right?
yeah.
And so what we have done here is we put it in a sheet. We laminate the sheet. We simply have a little blurb that says your card has been declined. Please provide an updated form of payment. You can write it in this laminated sheet so it can easily be, like a dry eraser type of thing. We
Hmm.
give it to them simply in a clipboard, almost as if they were just filling out any other clinical form. Nothing is shared, nothing is public. The patient feels safer, and it creates a environment that is already designed for any kind of inclusivity that we may need to think about. So how small is that, right? But we don't necessarily always think about that, and it has a huge domino effect in client retention, client safety, just the design of how we operate here. And it's a very small thing to do with
Yeah,
such huge results, you know?
yeah, for sure, for sure. We none of us like labels. We've talked about ADHD, a lot here so far in the program,
Hmm.
but you know that's not all who you are. You are also a Latina, and so
Hmm.
being a leader in a Latina leader, what specific challenges do you and leaders of Latina uh, uh, have that they have to look at that maybe the rest of us don't understand as much?
Yeah, so I want to introduce the term intersectionality. This is a term that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. And
Okay.
intersectionality is exactly that. It is understanding that people are multi-layered, that their experience in life is informed by the many identities that they are and hold. And yes, at one time, you can show up as many things. You are, we say it all the time, we just didn't have a word for it, right? We are a father, we are a brother, we are a leader, we are Latina, we are all of the things. The Latina identity for me is, I'm extremely proud of it. My culture, I believe, when you look at ADHD from a cultural lens, it is not something that is really understood. It is not something that is immediately welcomed, I guess. It is certainly questioned. However, when I have mixed my cultural, let's say, scripts, right, where women are supposed to be a certain way. My culture is submissive. We are subservient. Men are sort of very patriarchal, that kind of thing. To me, in my experience, that type of thing has fueled a lot of rebellion and it has fueled a lot of the empowerment work that I do around women and teaching them that these cultural scripts can actually look very powerful in leadership when Latinas are essentially called very nurturing. I mean, this is women in general, but to Latinas specifically, we're nurturing, we're motherly, we are so loving, that kind of stuff. In a leadership aspect, I'm glad that those are the qualities that I have, right?
Yeah.
My lived experience directly translates to my professional competency. I am somebody who is kind. I am somebody who is loving. And I can put that through leadership in a way that makes sense. And so there's a lot of my culture that shows up in leadership,
That's
community,
really,
all of
yeah,
that.
really interesting you describe it that way because I think some people could look at that and say, "Oh, this is the way I'm perceived," or
Hmm.
this is what people think, therefore I'm going to come out very different. And
Right.
that's kind of a disaster too, right? If you come out and you're not compassionate, you're too, you're trying to reverse all the assumptions, that usually is worse.
Yeah, and it's very difficult for women navigating male-dominated spaces, and male-dominated professions because what gets you to the top is, less emotion, very structured, hard boundaries, you're sort of like a hard nose. And that may very well be what works for you, but I encourage the exploration of how you can balance who you really are, if that is not who you are, but who those, those traits that may be some traits that you are essentially putting to the side. Let's explore how those things can live together, because it becomes very exhausting to do all of those things when that's not naturally who you are.
Absolutely. I think causes a real conflict.
Hmm.
And I would make the argument that leadership going more towards what you just described is better for business and is better for the future. We just have to adopt it and be okay with it and not try and go back to, the command and control way of the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that sometimes, we ask ourselves like, well, why are women, better to lead in, some of these male sort of roles where typically they're held by males and all of this stuff. And honestly, who knows more about the oppressor than the oppressed, in
Yeah.
a matter of thinking, right? If a woman is really like when she is challenged on her expertise around how to work with men specifically, like I said, very concentrated on male dominated fields, who is more competent than someone who's had to fight all their life to prove themselves? They
Yeah.
understand this nature. Um, and I use the word oppressor because that's, kind of like what we talk about a lot, but essentially that is what I'm saying. The people who have to deal with a certain demographic all of their life, when they are taught to formalize that experience, they are the most powerful in working with that demographic.
Interesting. Could you tell us what is neurospicy leadership?
So neurospicy is one of the terms that I've coined for myself. I've turned it into a framework through my doctoral research. So spicy, it stands for self-awareness, purpose, innovation, courage, and yielding transformation. And I organize my thinking through this framework. So when I think about what makes a good leader, what are some of the core values that we hold? We're talking about self-awareness, understanding how you think, your work, how you respond, and those around you. Your purpose, are you connected to your work, right? Is there something meaningful to you? That's going to really drive an ADHDer. Innovation, are you open to thinking? Honor your creativity, create spaces for different ways of thinking and encourage that in your team. The courage that it takes to either disclose or hold space for someone else who's disclosing to you, be willing to adjust, right? And to what isn't working, and having the courage to go against some of the things that may have already been in place and they're antiquated and stuff like that. And then, of course, yielding transformation is staying open to growth and change. A lot of the times leaders get stuck on, the way that I think is the right way, and I have all the answers, or I need to have all the answers. And understanding that that's not the case, understanding that you are not, the smartest person in the room always, that you can extract from others, and learning how to do that yields a transformation in both your teams, in yourself, in your career. And so being open to that. So that's a way to think about, for me, personal development and how to shape your teams.
As we heard in the bio, you're a coach, you're a mental health professional. What is the difference between coaching and counseling with people that you work with?
Well, there is a difference. So not everyone who is seeking help with their ADHD needs therapy. Therapy is great, but I am of the mind that it's not for everybody. There's a million different ways to go through therapy. Coaching is essentially skill building, right? It is an accountability partner. It is a strategic partnership, and learning and developing your own skills as a professional, as a individual going through life, whatever it is that you're seeking coaching for. If it is specific to ADHD, then you are essentially learning how to keep yourself uh, at a level that doesn't feel like you're always catching up. And so that type of coaching provides that type of accountability, awareness, a space to vent, some of your own experiences, to process some of those experiences. It provides actual scripts. If there is, if you're coming up for a promotion, how can we actually coach you through this? Let's role play. Therapy, on the other hand, is clinical. It is based on clinical theory. It is based on clinical modalities. And so we understand via diagnoses how to really work with a client to understand themselves at their core. So hence the reason why you need different licensing and different
Right,
certifications for
right,
each,
for sure.
right? As a therapist, as a counselor, you are looking to understand how that person reasons, how that person makes decisions, and how that person regulates. And in those three categories, whatever they are a deficit on, you are giving them the awareness of it. You are essentially putting a mirror to some of their own life experiences, and you're guiding them through the understanding of self. So it is a much deeper personal journey, guided by clinical knowledge, and theory and research and understanding what that looks like. And
Thank
also the
you.
power
Yeah.
to diagnose, right? We don't,
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up and describing that because I do think there's a big difference, and I have talked to some coaches where well you need to understand yourself first, and you need to get down, and in some of the ways they were taking the person to discover that made me uncomfortable in the sense like, whoa, that sounds like, getting some deep-seated therapy there. And then what if you get a person to where you've made them so vulnerable that how do you get them back? And you don't have the skills to get them back. So,
Absolutely.
I think that there are, I wouldn't say that's rampant, but I have run into a couple times when coaches have told me, well, I did this with this person, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh man, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. So I do think there's a definite one versus the other, and you shouldn't confuse them.
Yeah. And a therapist can be a coach. It is just a different approach, right? Now, when you're talking about certified coaching, and like you said, you honor your certification and your licensing, and there is a reason for those. But yeah, it is a very tricky space to be in as a coach, digging deep into a lot of emotional roots. You definitely want to tread carefully.
Right. So, how can you be resilient without being exhausted?
Oh man, that's a great question. How can you be resilient without being exhausted? My immediate response to that is that exhaustion is our cross to bear.
Yeah.
We are just exhausted by nature because just we're, living with ADHD in this particular society at this time that we're living in is exhausting. How we fight through that, I think it brings me back to my own framework is grounding yourself in your purpose. How are you resilient? Is increasing your bandwidth to deal with, I guess, negative, to deal with anything that may be challenging in life. Um, Catherine Wonga, I believe her first name is Catherine, but Wonga is her last name. She's the CEO of Essence. She has this thing she calls the 5 fails a day. And I absolutely love it because it's not meant for ADHDers, it's meant for everyone, but it speaks to us. It is the ability to quantify your bad days. And so this is something that I've taught my team. If you are able to identify what bad actually means, so let's say you are not allowed to call your day a bad day unless you've hit your sixth fail of the day. So let's identify what a fail looks like. You get this turnaround of people almost like competitive, like, no, I only hit three or I only hit two. And so it says, well, how many bad days did you have this week? Actually, I didn't have any bad days because you've now quantified like you really only allowed to call yourself a bad day or to call it a bad day if you've hit six. If you do hit six, and there's a process for you to refill your cup and come back. What that does is increase your tolerance for challenges. And so not everything rocks you, right? Not everything has the ability to destabilize you. You understand that this is a challenge. Okay, this happened in my day. That felt not great. I'm going to consider that a fail. That's fail number one. And if nothing else happens in the day, I had a good day. You
Yeah.
get what I mean? And so it's just kind of that mentality of reframing the way that we look at certain things and perspective. But I really love that because it works for a lot of analytical brains where you're able to actually quantify good and bad.
That makes a lot of sense. And sometimes we don't give, uh, what am I trying to say, like uh, purpose or credibility to what comes to mind is like say that you're a songwriter and you
Hmm.
spent, 4 or 5 days just going nowhere, like you might call it writer's block, and you're just like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And then on the
Hmm.
fifth day, you write, a number one song that everyone's loved for decades in 20 minutes. So you'd say, well, that was a fantastic day, but you might say that those previous 4 or 5 days leading up to it helped you get there. You just can't identify it.
That's
So
correct.
yeah,
That's
so
very true.
you need to give credence to that as well, I think.
Yes, you need to give space. It is very hard as a writer, as a songwriter, whatever it is. When you do get that writer's block, a lot of times you'll just go on like a retreat. You kind of isolate, you give yourself a couple of days. It is in that process that many people don't understand that there is a lot of things going on in your brain. And a lot of these creative ideas can literally just come from any type of interaction that you're having during that time. And it's just marinating and it's thinking about it. That is genuinely how I approach problems. That is how I approach any type of project. If I know that this is the ask, I am thinking about it every day. Every day, there's a different idea. I write things down, I come back to it. Absolutely. And many people don't understand that type of process. It almost feels like you're wasting your time or you're just having an excuse to go. You know what I mean?
Are we getting any better in corporate America or business in America as far as identifying and dealing with and being okay with mental health discussion?
I would like to think so. We certainly still have a long way to go. But when we talk about mental health, and typically, by the way, ADHD doesn't usually get connected to mental health conversations. ADHD is usually owned by the medical community, psychology, psychiatry. Um, Hardly ever does it get a lot of highlight in the mental health community. And that bridge is essentially the my work as a social worker. I would like to think that organizations are beginning to understand the importance of mental health in general, to whether, where they are in the process of embedding that into their organizational cultures varies. But I do think that as a society, we are understanding that mental health is critical. It is critical to our success. It is critical to our development. And I wish that, I hope that we do get to a point where when we think about therapy, we think about it almost as a PCP, as a pediatrician. You have a child, typically you have a pediatrician, and that pediatrician follows you until you transition to an adult medicine doctor. What's wrong with having a therapist through your development? What is wrong with having a counselor as a parent through your parenting journey? Right? Therapy doesn't always have to wait until something is wrong. And I think that's one of the biggest reframes that we're going through, whether it's organizationally or individual. Mental health is absolutely something that needs to be embedded in our conversations day to day. And I do think that we're moving in that direction.
That's a great point. Well, Sandra, we've covered a lot of ground today, but anticipation of our discussion, is there anything we haven't discussed or we haven't brought up that you want to be sure and get in the program today?
And we have covered a lot. I just want ADHDers out there who are listening or who think that they may be ADHDers. Don't feel shame. There's a lot of beautiful things that come with it. Just learn, be grace, allow yourself grace and be kind to yourself. There's a lot of beautiful things that come with ADHD despite its heaviness.
At this point in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question, and that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a
Mhm.
pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
Mm, you are not broken. You are different. So to my ADHDers out there, you are not broken. You are simply just different.
Well said. Well, Sandra, this has been a lot of fun and I've learned a lot. I was anxious to get you on the program to learn about this topic, and you did a great job at explaining to us the definitions, but also the real life experiences. And I really appreciate your vulnerability and telling about your life situation as well. So I think that was really helpful. So thanks for being on the show today. It's been great.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, and maybe we'll meet somewhere down the road one of these days.
Sounds good to me.
Bye bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.